Hey, what's going on, everyone? It's another episode of Retro Tidbits, the show where I explain the general overview, history, gameplay mechanics, and just kind of review the basics of some old retro favorites. And today we are doing something that I am as excited as a little Japanese schoolgirl over, and coincidentally it is a Japanese franchise. We're doing Dragon Ball, but not Dragon Ball Z, not Dragon Ball Super, or the worldwide hated Dragon Ball GT. We are focusing on the original Dragon Ball. And there aren't too many games that I know of that were released in the West about the original Dragon Ball franchise, but today we're focusing on a game called Dragon Ball Advanced Adventure, and this came out for the GBA. So, like I said, today we're going to do our normal format. It is me rolling solo yet again, but I mean, I'm such an impeccable host. What are you going to do? So that said, I'm going to make this episode as short and concise as possible because I'm the biggest Dragon Ball fan that I know of. I have all of the volumes of the manga, and that goes for original. And, as you know, it's not split into Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z. In the manga, it's just one continuous series called Dragon Ball. I have all of those. I have all of the released Dragon Ball Super. I have all of the DVDs for Dragon Ball, all the Blu-rays for Dragon Ball Z. I have all the movies. I went and saw the Broly movie that came out for Super in January. I left my wife at home and went and saw that by myself. So let me just say I'm a dedicated fan, but I'm going to try to keep this episode as concise as possible without me delving into my deepest passions for Dragon Ball. So that said, let's go ahead and we are going to focus on a little bit of the history and development of this game. Okay, so let's look a little bit about the history behind Dragon Ball Advanced Adventure for the Game Boy Advance. So initially it released in Japan in November 18th of 2004. Europe, it came out on June 17th of 2005. And a little less than a year later in North America, it finally released in 2006, and that was in June of 2006. Now, the game is developed by a development team called DIMPS, and I'm sure you're familiar with them, but we will go into the history of them here in a second. So let's just touch the basics with them. They are a Japanese development studio based in Osaka, Japan. Never been to Tokyo. Very nice. Osaka, I'm coming for you next. Anyways, they are most known for their wave of licensed games that I guess they started to begin working on in the early 2000s and onward. And they have had their hands on franchises like Dragon Ball, Digimon, Sonic the Hedgehog, Naruto, Street Fighter, and a couple more. But I would say that just naming those alone tells you how trusted they are with publishers and how willing they are to hand over their mainstay franchises. So honestly, yeah, that's a lot of big name franchises, and frankly, those same franchises produce a shit ton of games, and a lot of them, they come out at the same production rate of rabbits producing offspring. So for the sake of staying on track here, I'm just going to name some of the most noteworthy projects that DIMPS has worked on and see if you can recognize any of these titles and just surmise how successful these games have been. So they've done the DBZ Budokai series. They worked on the Sonic Advance series for the GBA, Digimon Battle Spirit. They did Sonic Generations, which is a fan favorite Sonic game. They worked on Kirby and the Amazing Mirror. They worked with Capcom on Street Fighter V, and they've also worked with the Dragon Ball Xenoverse franchise. And like I said, there are a lot more, but those are just some of the main ones I thought might paint a picture in your head. So DIMPS has been around since March of 2000. And like I said, they have their hands on quite a lot of entertainment series. Let's just say they're not going anywhere anytime soon. And that said, let's focus on the publisher of Dragon Ball Advanced Adventure, which actually gets a little interesting because the publisher actually varies depending on the region in which you are. So in Japan, it was, I guess, published by company called Banpresto. I'm not sure. And then North America, it was published by Atari, and Bandai is who published it in Europe. And the reason for these different publishers across different regions, in my estimation at least, is that this is before Bandai Namco merged. So in the days before Bandai Namco, and they had their sovereign control over the distribution of Dragon Ball games, Atari had the rights to do it in North America. So if you look back at games like the Budokai series, Advanced Adventure, obviously, and Dragon Ball Sagas, God, that game is terrible. Maybe on a different day. Anyway, if you look at any of those games that I just listed, you will see the good old Atari logo slapped in the box art. But after the release of Budokai Tenkaichi, which is a different franchise altogether from the Budokai series, Atari's name wouldn't be associated with future releases, as their distribution rights were actually absorbed into the Bandai Namco merger. So that's just a little history surrounding the game. And so now I think it would be smart to transition into the game overview. Okay, here we are. My favorite part of this show, it's the game overview, where we get to dig deep into the general mechanics and the audio, visual, all that good stuff of the game. So let's start off with the, format and the mechanics of the game. And this game, simply put, is a side-scrolling beat-em-up, as simple as they come. It plays much like many of the great beat-em-ups before it. So if you're a fan of Streets of Rage, Final Fight, Battletoads, TMNT, the arcade games, the X-Men arcade game, the Simpsons arcade game, or even that great old arcade cabinet Golden Axe, then you know exactly what to expect here. It's the same old button mashing action that you've come to know and love. However, it is set in the mystical world of Dragon Ball. That said, it's not 100% a beat 'em up, and it's not 100% side-scrolling goodness. That said, let's kind of break it down. And the best way to do that is to look at this game into three different aspects. Let's lump them into three different categories, rather. So the first one that you'll see is the traditional side-scrolling beat-em-up style. And this is where you traverse the level in horizontal fashion. You will punch, kick, and key blast through hordes of enemies. Goku is also pretty nimble and agile in the game, even though he's small and chubby. So the actual platforming that you are doing is pretty satisfying and responsive, albeit sometimes the positioning of the camera kind of produces some inauspicious positions for you, meaning that sometimes, and maybe it's avoidable, I came across it more times than I'd like to, but sometimes I had to unwillingly take a couple leaps of faith, and that kind of just led me into a throng of baddies. It was like crowd diving, or stage diving, whatever you call it, into just people wanting to claw at me and hurt me. So not the most ideal situation. It's not a deal breaker, though. Like I said, it's probably avoidable. I'm just the closest thing to like a speedrunner that you'll find for someone who's doing a first-time playthrough. But most of the game is played in this format. It's pretty satisfying and fun, and you will find a fair number of your mini bosses and bosses you'll encounter them in this fashion. So prepare to play most of the game in this way, but like I said, not a bad problem to have. Now, the second type of gameplay you will find in this game comes from Nimbus levels, and in these levels, Goku fights through more waves of enemies and sometimes some boss fights, just a couple. But this time you do so in the sky. And I know what you're thinking, Goku couldn't really fly in Dragon Ball. So yes, that means that you will be aided by your trusty Kinto-un, which is in the English dub, the Flying Nimbus. These levels are obviously a little different from traditional side-scrolling, as you can tell by the description. But one major difference comes from the fact that the levels are actually more like auto-scroll levels. And I've been coming across a lot of those, obviously, through Super Mario Maker 2. So if you've been playing that recently, expect to get the same vibe going on here, except, you're on the back of a cloud and you get to shoot Kamehameha waves if you choose to do so. So you don't physically make your level advance by running across the screen so much as you're along for the very enemy-filled ride, but you can still move about pretty freely throughout whatever you're seeing on the board. But the pace of the level is more so dictated rather and determined by auto scroll. So just a side note there. And lastly, the third feature of the game, the third type of gameplay you'll encounter while playing this game is kind of like a 2D fighting game. And these levels are basically matches of a fighting game. So think of these more like the traditional fighting game franchises like Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat, but slap a Dragon Ball skin on it. And then condense and simplify all of the features of those franchises that I mentioned earlier. And you basically got this. These sections more so implement the combat controls of the beat 'em up section, so there aren't like a dedicated move set or anything like that that you'll find when you switch to this format. But you will easily breeze through these fighting sections by applying the button matching skills you've learned along the way. So don't feel pressured to learn anything new. Then there's definitely not a lot of nuance in these levels, but there is a rhythm and rhyme to it, and it can be boiled down basically to into this. So in each battle, the key is to get your opponent airborne. In order to do this, though, you'll need to fill up your rush gauge, which is a little thing that kind of grows in the corner, like below your health meter as you're fighting. You do this, though, by landing blows to your opponent, and once you've filled up your rush gauge sufficiently, I'm pretty sure it's all the way, you've got to land a combo of 3 punches while simultaneously holding down the direction in which you're facing. So let's say Goku's enemy, let's say he's fighting Tien, and that enemy is to his right. So in other words, you're going to have to punch him 3 times while holding down the right directional pad button, and that will open up a sequence in which you can launch your opponent into the air, kind of hit them with a barrage or flurry of some hits, and then slam them onto the ground, and that leaves them stunned for a little bit there. And this is a good little strategy for anyone interested in playing this. Once they are stunned on the ground, you have a good like 3 to 5 seconds to charge up your Kamehameha wave to full completion. So once they stand up, as long as they don't jump, you can kind of hit them directly there with the Kamehameha wave, and it offers you a chance to do some pretty solid damage. Anyway, I just wanted to say those are the 3 main gameplay styles, but there are some additional modes after the story mode, which is obviously the main single-player campaign. There is a 1 versus 1 player fighting mode, so when you encounter new enemies in the game, they become unlockable players, and there are up to 30 unlockable players, though only Goku can be used for the story mode. Actually, that's incorrect. Side note, Krillin can be used for the story mode, but it's more just like it doesn't initiate any cutscenes. It doesn't do anything. You just kind of go through the notions of the story. So Goku's your main character. That said, as I mentioned, there are 30 characters that you can unlock, and these can be used in the 1 versus 1 player fighting mode, which is the exact same style of the 2D fighting, but you can play against someone else, presumably with a link cable, but I highly doubt you're going to be doing that in 2019. But it is fun, I guess, if you want to practice before you go back to the story mode. Now, after that, you have the extra mode, which is unlocked once you get the game completed, which means it's basically New Game Plus. So you just go back through the story with no cutscenes. I think you can just kind of breeze through, and you don't have to go in a linear order. You can bounce to every level that you've completed. And one major difference, though, in this New Game Plus is that there are a couple primary objectives now that you've beaten the game. So number 1, all of the red doors seen throughout the levels can now be opened, and a greater amount of items are placed in the stages, and mini games can be unlocked by finding all of the 54 items. I've not done that. I'm not a completionist. I just beat this game to beat the game, and I enjoyed it. Not saying like I beat it as a tedious task or something, but you know, I'm not that interested in unlocking some mini games that I'll play by myself. The second main objective for the New Game Plus is that you can unlock different characters to use now. And each has like a corresponding portrait hidden in one of the levels, must be found to unlock the character for use. And you can also use these characters in mini games. It's really not much to look forward to. I would focus on, just enjoying yourself in the story, because the story can be fun, and it's a fun little jaunt of about 3.5 hours. I mean, I got sick a couple weeks ago, and I beat this game and just sitting down, taking Dayquil on a day off from work, so I was sick. And like I said, it was a fun little jaunt and a lot of fun. Now, I'm going to move on to the story, but before doing that, I want to focus on 3 more things. And one of those is the game's controls. And honestly, there are some of the most controls I've come across on the GBA, period. The platforming, for what it is, that being, an ancillary feature of the game, is incredibly satisfying. The physics all feel very fluid, and the combat is really crisp and tight also. So like unleashing a barrage of blows and incorporating like jumping, dodging, and blocking into the onslaught of baddies heading your way feels fantastic. And I just wanted to commend the developers for that. There's just something about like basic controls of a game. So like if developers can make it so simply just moving around and throwing punches is fulfilling, then you've got some potential for a great game at your disposal. And this game is definitely no exception. So bravo on the controls, very crisp. Next, we're going to do the visuals. And the visuals in this game, they are pretty. The sprites, they look great for a Game Boy Advance game. They definitely cut a lot of corners, though, in regard to the sprites. I say this because while the enemy sprites are colored perfectly, they're vivid and they're detailed enough. There's not a lot of variety with the cannon fodder, like the enemies that come in waves. Most of the time, it's a wolf, a dog, human, soldier. You know how Akira Toriyama used anthropomorphized animals all the time. Most of the enemies are those anthropomorphized animals, or a robot or android of some type. And these enemies are overutilized, and for the most part, they're usually just palette-swapped versions of each other. But the individual character sprites for like the mainstay characters like Goku, Krillin, Jackie Chun, Chaozu, Tien, all those people, they all look fantastic. So another pat on the back to Dimps for that one. The audio, lastly, isn't really something I pay a lot of attention to in a beat 'em up. And that's not because, the music is bad or I'm condemning the composers. I'm just saying that I don't pay too much mind to them because it's a beat 'em up and you're constantly mashing buttons and hearing the grunts and screams of your playable characters and, like withering enemies. So it can be a bit cumbersome on the ears to expose yourself to that for 3.5 hours as you work to beat the game. That said, the music was pretty solid for the most part. No complaints. Nothing to write home about, but nothing that would leave you with your ears bleeding. So that's a plus. That said, I went back to play this game for the episode. Like I said, which is the inspiration for the episode, is me being sick on that couch. And about halfway through the story mode, I put earbuds in and started listening to a podcast. And like I said, this isn't to condemn the composer or to shame them. It is mainly because of what I said. It's a little tiresome to go through an entire game and hearing the same, like, and you were going to kill like 1,000 enemies, if not more. So, yeah. But, not to condemn the audio. It's all pretty good. So there you go. That said, that's everything I have in regards to the game overview. So I want to move on to the story. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm a huge Dragon Ball fan. I'm not like super fan number one, but I am pretty damn close. I have insane amounts of trivial knowledge for this franchise, and I just genuinely love it so very much. So believe me when I say I could break this entire story section down into very minute details and take up a lot of your time, but I'm pretty sure you're familiar enough with the Dragon Ball franchise. Even if you've not seen Dragon Ball, you got the basic rudiments and pieces when you came into the franchise with Dragon Ball Z that you understood it. So I won't break it down too much, but I will go over what I have in my notes. And Dragon Ball is a massive franchise, so like I said, many people are familiar with it. but those familiar with DBZ and not Dragon Ball will be more than likely satisfied and find this recap sufficient. And if you choose not to ever go back and read the original 16 volumes of Dragon Ball or go back and watch the anime, that's fine. This game is a fine recap, I suppose, even though, cuts out major points, blah, 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 blah. That's expected. It's a video game. There is one noteworthy omission from the main plot of Dragon Ball, but we'll get there in a minute. We will cross that bridge when we get to that. But first, let's just review what's all in the game before I go into an hour and a half of trying to summarize the plot of Dragon Ball. And to do that, I'll just mention the sagas or arcs that are featured in the game, and I'm sure you'll find some recollection of what I'm talking about. So, the first saga that you're going to jump into is the Emperor Pilaf saga, which, is the first saga of Dragon Ball. Then it goes into the Tournament saga, where you meet Krillin, start training under Master Roshi, all that good stuff. The next is you have the Red Ribbon Army saga. So you go through hordes of baddies, fight giant robots, that General Blue saga. That is mainly covered in the form of a boss battle against General Blue. Commander Red, you do the Muscle Tower fights and all that stuff and fight through hordes of baddies. Who would have thought? The Fortune Teller Baba saga, that is a good portion of the game because that just implements a lot of the 2D fighting mechanics, which is satisfying. Lastly, you have the Tien Shinhan saga, which is like the Crane School saga, where you're fighting in the World Tournament again, and you get some more 2D fighting there. And lastly, it ends with the King Piccolo saga, which is a little disappointing because that means that the Piccolo Jr. saga is the one that is absent from the game, and that's the last saga of Dragon Ball before it switches over to Z. My theory here is that the developers did not want to bother with designing an older character model for Goku, and they probably didn't want to have to incorporate flying around or something into the mechanics of the one-on-one fighting sequences that would inevitably have to be a part of the game if it were going to feature this saga and Goku's fight against Piccolo Jr. So that said, that's basically the story of the game. It goes through just sagas that everyone knows and loves, so I don't see the point in delving too deep into the plot points here. If you need a quick recap, this game serves as a pretty good option, or you could quit being that guy and just pick up the first 16 volumes of Dragon Ball. It's not that big a deal. Okay, that said, that was my concise version of the story. So let's just end it with the reception, recommendation, and some final thoughts. Okay, let's dive into the final segment of the show, which is where I give you some final thoughts. We talk about the reception that the game received critically, and we discuss whether or not I would recommend it to you, the listener. So, Dragon Ball Advanced Adventure definitely flew under the radar, and I would be willing to wager that this is for two major reasons. Number one, Dragon Ball, the original series, was very, very poorly marketed in the Western market, and it was actually marketed to kids, believe it or not, and as a result, it lost a lot of the comedic and kind of quirky charms of the manga and the anime, and censorship and localization just were the two major reasons for that, and it just kind of made the English dub a real bore, and it really didn't do much to compete with the absurdly overpowered battles and storylines that were going on in Z at the time. In other words, anything with Z thrown into the title was way more popular and in a much better position to outsell and outperform the original Dragon Ball game. So that's one of the main reasons that this game flew under the radar. The second one, in my estimation, is that obviously the GBA was a fairly successful system. Let's start with that. But the console, though it sold 81 million units in its life cycle, was nothing in comparison to the Nintendo DS. And that's important to note because this game came out in the 2004 to 2006 range. That is the end of the life cycle for the GBA. The Nintendo DS came out in about 2005 or 2006, and that console went on to sell 154 million copies. So let me clarify that. The GBA sold 81 million in its entire life cycle. 154 million DS units were sold. That's about half, almost half. So to put a game out on the GBA in the end of its life cycle was basically a death sentence for getting this game to sell like gangbusters. And I know, the original DS was backwards compatible, so you could technically buy this game and play it on your Nintendo DS. But if it's 2005 and I just dropped money for a Nintendo DS with its awesome touchscreen interface, I'm not going to go spend $30, $40 on an older game to play on my shiny new Nintendo DS. And I think a lot of people shared that same sentiment, which is one of the main reasons this game flew under the radar. But sales aside from this game, it did meet some pretty favorable reviews, nothing amazing though. So IGN and GameSpot respectively gave the game a 7.5 out of 10. Nintendo Power graced it with a 7 out of 10, and GameSpy gave it 4 out of 5. So I think that would technically be the most favorable, as that equals out to about 80%. The Metacritic aggregate score, God, that's hard to say, is about a 75 out of 100, as you could tell by the math that I gave you above. So it's about that 75% range. All in all, the game is slightly better than average based on what critics had to say. But in my opinion, if you're into beat 'em ups, that is, you've got to get this one. It's a great one to give a shot. It's pretty, it's fun, it's crisp, and the controls and audio and stuff like that. And it's certainly easy to digest, especially if you're a fan of the story of Dragon Ball. If not, just skip through the cutscenes and it's a beat 'em up. Boom, problem solved. If you're just a fan of Dragon Ball, you got to just play it, even if you're not a fan of beat 'em ups. It's so much fun and it looks pretty, and it's nice to see, cartoony sprite versions of your favorite characters, because nowadays we just have the crazy polygonal models and whatever the hell Dragon Ball FighterZ is. That game is beautiful, but the simplicity in this game is, it'll have you remembering those good old nostalgic years. And as I mentioned, the game's only 3.5 to 4 hours in the story mode, so it's really just a simple little game to pick up, put down in between work or whatever, however you want to play it, that's up to you. Now, if you want to play the game, you can buy a copy used on Amazon. I didn't see anything less than like $35 or higher though, so maybe you could emulate it. That's what I did when I was sick, but I've also owned the game. I was just too sick to move my GameCube, plug it in, put the Game Boy player in, and shove this thing in, and hope that I can find my adapter for my 4K TV to go back to the RGA. So if you have a RetroPie or Raspberry or whatever you call them, maybe play it that way. It's definitely worth a shot, guys. Okay, that said, that was my attempt at a concise episode touching on my favorite franchise of all time. Dragon Ball Advance Adventure is a fun game. I highly recommend it. It's for the GBA. Guys, thank you for coming along on this little mystical adventure. And I hope you had a lot of fun. And next time we'll review something even more obscure.